Good evening, everyone. This is Steve Ward with Docked Out. I'm thrilled that you have joined the program. Welcome and have a great time. This is your host, Steve Ward, and I want to invite you to visit our website, dockedout.org, for blogs and some more video podcasts. There you can click subscribe to join an online community to exchange ideas and comments and to enjoy exploring some other topics. I'm on YouTube, Facebook, and Instagram. Just search for Docked Out Official, all together as one word, Docked Out Official. And also, there's a great opportunity to participate in some conversation and questions tonight. Enter some chat. Just let us know, who you are, where you're from, any questions or comments, and towards the end of the program, I'd be happy to address those and crank through those and have some fun with some of those questions. So tonight, I'd like to talk about some more issues that I think are just so super important for today. I'm continuing a series on LGBTQIA ideology. And I just want to preface this by saying that this is a very sensitive area, as you know, very controversial, highly charged emotionally, regardless of what side of the aisle that you may fall on. So just remember that. And I just want to put out a challenge to all of us. Let's just be great listeners to other people that have a differing opinion. The church, we just cannot ignore this issue. We have to confront this head on, but we have to be loving in our approach. Sometimes I hear some offhand comments that might be off-putting to people that are struggling with this, and let's avoid that. Let's just listen and let's build some relationship and enter into dialogue with people who have legitimate questions about, what's going on and can I change my gender? Why not? What about my friends at school who are going through this? What do I say? What do I do? These are all massively important issues for the church. And then, of course, for people who have doubts and have questions on where the church stands on some of these things, we've got to be able to have constructive conversation. So I put out that challenge across the board. So what I'd like to do tonight, a few different things. I want to summarize for you a little bit more of the postmodern and progressive background, the leanings that go into the LGBTQIA movement, and then discuss some new gender terminology, but then highlighting some of the assumptions and the underlying biases that are actually part of the language itself. If you were with us on the last program, I dug into that quite a bit. So enjoy that and check that out at your leisure. It's posted on the social media platforms. But I want to continue that a little bit, not to get too bogged down in more of that necessarily, but I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about the LGBTQIA ideology and how it's creeping into the health system, our public schools, and other forums in the cultural square, so to speak. And I want to help you understand some of the claims that are often made by proponents of this ideology or some of the activists who are really pushing this in the culture, and just explain why and how this is happening and some of the goals of the movement. And the highlight for tonight, at least for my mind, is I want to share with you several medical journals that are coming out of some prestigious publications that really take a look at the prevalence of transgender people or gender nonconforming people around the world, in the US, Netherlands, Brazil, a variety of countries that have done some studies. But it's important to know that some of those studies, many of them, are flawed statistically in terms of how they are constructed. And we'll walk through that together. So I don't want you to feel intimidated by that. I'll help. We're going to take an overview of some of those things and not get too bogged down into the weeds. But this is so critical. I really want to help you understand what is being put out there in some of the scientific literature. And I want to help you be discerning about what is reliable information that's coming out and what's not and why. So that's kind of where we're going tonight, and I'm hoping to continue this on in several future broadcasts. For example, next time we meet together, I want to talk about the intersex people. Who are intersex? What does that mean? And we talk about Turner syndrome, Klinefelter's, congenital adrenal hyperplasia, some of these other disease states that are being used to make the claim that there are a wide variety of genders out there. Well, is that true? We have to answer that question, and we have to be objective and thorough and help people to understand that not everything you're hearing from media, from doctors, and people who have that authority or perceived expertise are not necessarily telling you the whole story. So my goal is to help you be a little bit more armed in your ability to really understand what you're being told, and understand some of the problems in the conclusions that you're often hearing. Okay, so with that as a little bit of an intro, so I want you to remember that the LGBTQIA ideology is a product of postmodernism, okay, and progressive thinking. And what I mean by that is you have to first have a foundation that claims that there is no absolute truth, that things that like morality, right and wrong, is very subjective, and therefore you can just live according to your subjective opinions, or you could say according to your feelings. That's the you do you, I do me type of mentality that is so common today. That's part of what we call postmodernism. Now, LGBTQIA ideology is also based on progressive ideas. And what I mean by that is the so-called, dismantling of traditional terms, institutions, redefining language and words that have had a specific meaning for generations, but we're now redefining them, thinking that we've somehow arrived at a greater understanding of the world, and that gives us the obligation to redefine things as if we've somehow evolved further or made progress, hence the name progressivism. So there are a lot of problems with that type of ideology, but I want to put a little bit of that aside and just move a little bit quickly through a couple more terms I want to give you, and then we'll move into what's going on within the healthcare system. Okay, so you might hear the term gender incongruence. Okay, so here's the definition that you might often hear. It's an experienced incompatibility between the gender expected based on sex assigned at birth and gender identity. Okay, let me say that again. So, gender incongruence is an experienced incompatibility between the gender expected based on your sex assigned at birth and your gender identity. So, there are some assumptions going on here. So, notice that the words, it's an experience, okay, what you might expect, your chosen gender identity. So these are based on feelings. This is a feelings based term. And the incompatibility as an experience is a reference to feelings which comes from our mind. Okay, so our mind, in terms of how we feel, driving how we're going to now describe what's happening within this subset of individuals. There's also an assumption that your sex is assigned at birth. Actually, your sex is determined at conception, or you could make the argument that as God had creative intent towards you in his mind in eternity past, he had plans and a will for you. We talked about that a little bit. So your sex is not assigned by a doctor when you come out of the womb. Your sex is already determined in utero, and after you're born, we discover what that sex is, or maybe earlier based on ultrasounds or whatever. But we're not assigned a gender, but that's often the terminology that we're told. And the whole assumption that we can choose a different gender identity, but also have a different gender, more broadly speaking, than your actual sex gender, or that you can change it throughout your life. So those are massive, huge assumptions that you have to make in order to create a term such as gender incongruence. Now, we agree that gender incongruence is an incompatibility between the mind and the body, right? That's what's going on, but we disagree on the cause and we disagree on the actual treatment for that. So that's gender incongruence. Another term that is important to know is gender dysphoria. Okay, so this used to be defined as distress. Okay, pretty significant distress that's due to the gender incongruence that we just talked about. But I want you to know that the word distress has been substituted by the words dislike or a discomfort. Okay, so in the ICD-11, that's an acronym. It stands for the International Classification of Diseases, the 11th edition, so to speak. The terminology is more reflective of feelings based, of having a dislike or a discomfort rather than a more severe distress. Now, that might seem like a very minor issue, but actually it's huge because what you're going to do is capture a wide breadth of people who you're going to say have come into the gender non-conforming population because of a dislike or a discomfort. But remember, you have to define those terms. What does it mean to be uncomfortable? What does it mean to not like your body? That can be very subjective. But we're broadening who we are saying are how many people in the population are part of this community. And it's a softening of terms because we don't want to offend. That's also part of progressivism, and to include more people in this umbrella. And actually, if you think about what's happening and some of the studies we're going to get into, what we're doing is saying that there are many more people who have gender nonconformity. And therefore, because of their gender dysphoria, their discomfort, we now have to offer gender affirming care, which would be your hormone therapies, your surgery, and a variety of other things can get thrown into the hat. So we're using assumptions to create terminology to create a population of people who then are eligible for a new treatment that is risky, that is expensive, that is poorly studied, etc. This is a really big deal. So I want you to just try to be attentive to the language that's often being used and always be thinking, what are the assumptions behind some of these words? What are the definitions? Often it's not well explained. Okay, now here's another example. In the DSM-5, that's a manual. It stands for the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. Okay, so the 5th edition is out. So the mental disorder type of terminology that used to be used to describe transgenderism has been moved out of the mental disorder category, and we're now describing transgenderism as a variation or a difference in sex development. And this is especially important for the intersex subpopulation that we'll get to some other time soon. But it's basically saying that these are new genders, when in fact these are disease states or genetic defects, not new genders. They're disorders of the norm. So the language being softened, where this is no longer a mental health issue, this is a variation or just a difference in the gender spectrum. That has been changed for some dubious reasons, I feel, where we're trying to put feelings ahead of what is really going on. Feelings before fact, where we don't want to be offensive by treating somebody for what is a mental health issue. So we downplay the mental health component within the LGBTQIA movement. And also there is an assumption that people who are gender non-conforming are so because there is some underlying genetic defect in the brain or in an organ system that is leading them down that path. So there's a bias there where we're assuming there's a biologically based problem. We just haven't found it yet, but we assume that there will be one. So now we're going to create a whole infrastructure of language and terms and redefinitions and treatment plans based on those assumptions, even though there is really no objective evidence for them. Okay, so this is where we're heading. So gender dysphoria, that's the dislike that I was talking about, is really the target of the gender affirming care. So you'll hear in healthcare, we provide gender affirming care. So what that means is we're treating people who have gender dysphoria. So they dislike or they're unhappy or dissatisfied with their mind body disconnect. And gender affirming care can be a whole number of things that is offered through the health system. Okay, so just to dive a little bit more into the gender dysphoria for a moment, then we'll move on a little bit to some of the claims that are out there. So traditionally, the terminology gender dysphoria, you have to meet certain criteria in order to be diagnosed with it. So your symptoms have to be going on for at least 6 months. They have to be clinically important, a source of distress. It has to affect you socially or at work or in other important areas. Okay, and you have to, there's further criteria to meet in order to be given this diagnosis officially by a healthcare provider. You have to have, it's the intense need to do away with sex features or the intense desire to have sex features of the other gender, or a deep desire to transform into another gender, or the profound need for society to treat them as another gender. Okay, so this is part of the terminology that's being used. It's really interesting to think of. It's also very, very much feelings based. Okay, so we're talking about the need, the desire, the need, and what was a little bit even more concerning to my mind was that this need for society, so for others to treat you in a certain way. So in other words, we're not standing in our own identity as human beings created in the image of God by God who reflect the image of God. Instead, we're wanting other people externally to treat us in such a way that we receive our identity from an outside source, from other people. And it's because of that that leads us down this very dangerous path of forcing others to use preferred pronouns, and then you get into the whole women's sports issue and the boys using girls' locker rooms and bathrooms and all of those messy legal things that are going on right now. The basis is in this idea that I want other people to approve or to think of me as the other gender. That's the source of identity that is being used, and I think that's sad. I really do. I mean that, and I feel like what we need to do is help people understand that their identity is in Christ, right? We're made in the image of God. We reflect his nature. He loves us, chose us, and so forth, before we were even created. Let me move on into some of the claims that are being made within the kind of gender affirming care type of ideas. So this whole gender affirming care really relies on these claims, and I'll try to explain it here the best that I can. But one of the key claims is that there's this huge prevalence or a huge number of transgender individuals in the population that we just didn't know about before. And the idea is that we now are identifying them because of socio-political advances, the improved number of referrals being made to gender affirming care clinics, improved access to healthcare, improved access to health insurance and medical information, less cultural stigma, and so forth. Now, some of that might be true, but it's important to know what are the real numbers, and that's the articles that I'm going to get into with you here tonight. But remember that this is progressive, right? And there's actually assumptions that basically this is what this is really saying, is that there have been transgender individuals all along, but they've been afraid to come forward and receive care because they have been a marginalized, oppressed group. And if we just weren't so oppressive, then they would come forward in greater numbers. So that's the assumption and the claim that is being made. But there's no role or acknowledgement of the influence of the internet, of social media, the time that adolescents spend on smartphones, where they're being indoctrinated by so-called experts who are welcoming them into the LGBTQIA community with open arms. A vulnerable group of people. There's the breakdown of traditional family. There's fatherlessness. There's, rampant increases in mental health disorders that are underlying the LGBTQIA type of gender nonconformity. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about tonight will really illustrate that, how the studies that are illustrating how many transgender individuals there really are really cannot well identify them, and really cannot answer the question of what is causing that gender dysphoria. Okay, so these studies are not structured, they're not capable of answering those questions, yet they're being put forth through the media and social media as fact, and that's creeping its way into public schools and into the health system. And we're creating a whole structure of treatment plans and other things based on these things. So we're going to take a look at some of these flawed studies here in a moment, but I want to leave you with this idea. So traditionally, historically, if you look back a ways, the incidence, or the rate of childhood gender dysphoria was about 0.01%, and it was mostly all boys that were affected. So 0.01%, that's 1 in 10,000. And most of them, 70 to 80% of that small number, would outgrow the dysphoria and go on to have a normal life. So this is a very small subset of individuals historically. But what we're now seeing in some of these studies that I'm going to share with you tonight, that over the past 10 years, only the past 10 years or so, we now have estimates that as high as 8.4% of all children and adolescents are transgender or have gender dysphoria, are gender questioning or gender diverse. Okay. So this is like an 840 times of the original incidence that has been studied. So what I would say is there's something wrong with the data. You know what I mean? And we need to understand how these studies are being done and what we can and what we can't conclude from them. This massive increase in the past 10 years of over 800 times the number of kids coming forward with gender dysphoria, to me, that also that is evidence that this is not a biological problem. Okay, if there was a genetic defect or some type of mutation or some type of abnormality that led to an inherited pattern of transgenderism or risk factors for gender nonconformity, those rates would be stable. And we would see a relatively consistent incidence of that type of thing across the board. We wouldn't see this massive increase in the number of people coming forward. So something is very wrong here. And that is really what motivated me to dig into this for you to help us understand a little bit more. So we're going to take a look at some of these studies. Here's another example of what is very subjective. So you can take a look, and this has been done. You can take a look at the medical records. You can do statistical analyses where you extract the rates of certain diseases or certain problems. You can get those things out of electronic medical records. The VA did this, Kaiser did this, Medicare has done it, some private insurance companies have done this. You basically go through the diagnosis codes that are associated with you in your chart. That's what they're doing. So there was an estimate that maybe 0.03% of individuals are transgender, that's still 3 times as high as traditionally 0.01%. So 0.01 to 0.03, there's a tripling there. But then this was looked at again um, by doing a more subjective search through the actual text, the body of some of the medical records, to try to more subjectively determine if the conversation was oriented around gender dysphoria, things like that. And when that was done, the incidence was higher, was about 0.08%. So we've gone from zero point zero 0.01 to 0.03 to 0.08. And I would argue that's because of the very subjective means that are being used to perform some of these studies. We need to take a hard look at that. Okay, so that's the first claim about the number of people who are involved. So the second claim that we'll get into is that if we support people better who have this gender incongruence, then they might not progress to have actual dysphoria that needs to be treated. So that's an interesting claim, and it could actually be true in a sense. And what I mean by that is that if you're starting at very early ages, um, telling people that they're a different gender or that they can change their gender, and they have this network of influence in their life from a very young age, then yeah, I mean, if they're fully accepted and affirmed, then they might not have the full blown gender dysphoria that we had typically been seeing. But that's not because of any issue with that person. It's because the ideology is being pushed at such young ages, and that's where the concern of indoctrination comes from. Okay. um, Another problem with this idea that we can just support people and prevent them from having more dysphoria is simply that there's no long-term evidence that that's true. Okay, so in the short term, a person who claims to have gender dysphoria, there's a community that's waiting for them. There are people to support them. There's the whole issue of affirmation and the gender affirming care and the preferred pronouns and all of these different things. So it almost self fulfills, the need that some of our at risk adolescents have to be part of a community. Remember, a lot of these kids are from broken homes. They have underlying mental health problems. So basically, they're being ushered into a community that is accepting them. So you're treating some of their distress by giving them friendships and a community that they wouldn't otherwise have. It's not that you're necessarily helping them through a gender transition, if that makes any sense. Um, so this claim that we can support people and prevent dysphoria is also ignoring the underlying mental health disorders that may be leading some of these people into their gender dysphoria to begin with. So you have circular logic going on here. And there's also a very variable discussion of what that support actually means. Are we talking about bathrooms and sports? Are we talking about social workers who meet with kids at public schools? I mean, and that's the problem, is that we don't know, because these terms are not well defined. And the last claim I wanted to summarize for you before we jump a little further into some of the journals is the claim that people with gender dysphoria might not seek gender affirming care because of problems in their family dynamics. Maybe the care isn't affordable, fear of safety if they come out on the job, fear of losing a job. So here again, we have this idea that this is in a group that is oppressed, a marginalized, victimized type of group. And that's where the division comes in. It's an assumption that the person is simply just not loved and cared for because of all kinds of other problems, and that there's fear of abuse and other things that might happen to them. Now, sadly, some of that may be true, but I don't think there's adequate, evidence to really, dig your heels in too deeply into that claim. So, we're assuming that if gender affirming care like hormone therapy and surgery was cheaper and there was more affirmation going on, that more people would want it. And that's not necessarily true. And the danger of these claims is that we now have policies that are forcing family members to violate their conscience and to affirm a gender transition, or to force employers to affirm a gender transition, or to force insurance companies to pay for this gender affirming care. We have laws in Canada that say that the government can remove kids from their homes if their parents do not affirm their gender transition. We have rising healthcare costs, and to go with it, we have a cancel culture where it's difficult to even talk about these things. So I know that's a lot of information. So I just wanted to give you that as a little bit of a backdrop to what we're really diving into. But it's important. I think we have to know more about the literature being used to justify some of these things that are going on. So let me give you a broad overview of some of the types of statistical studies that you may encounter. If you're doing Google searches, you're pulling journals, you might come across some of these terms. So let me explain them to you a little bit, and then we'll jump into the articles. So we have case reports, or basically opinion papers, where somebody who is interested in a topic or doing a study can write an opinion, or publish a paper describing what they think might be going on about any given issue. So that is considered very weak evidence, because it's basically just the opinion of whoever is writing the article. So it's a little bit negligible in a sense. But the next weakest is what is called a cross-sectional study. So that's basically just a survey where you're looking for data points across a number of people that you're getting to answer the survey, but you really can't analyze any of the behavior involved or cause and effect type of relationships. And these are the kinds of studies that are being used to look at the incidence of gender nonconforming individuals, and some of the conclusions that I've mentioned. These are cross-sectional studies. It's very poor in how they are structured, and we say the power that they have to stand behind their conclusion. Okay, they're very, very weak, and they're just not able to determine cause and effect. The next better level of a study is called a case control. So this actually looks into the past, and one example that you might be familiar with is smoking. So if you have two groups of people, one group develops lung cancer over time and the other one does not, what you can do is look back and say, okay, well, these people who developed lung cancer, what were they doing that was different, that might have been a risk factor? And then you can say, oh, okay, they were smokers. So that means that smoking, could possibly be a cause of lung cancer. So that's kind of how that works in a case control. They look back into the past and try to identify what people were doing that might have been a risky behavior. Next level is what we call a cohort study, which is more forward looking. So this is like the next level, where now we have the idea that smoking might lead to lung cancer, but now we have to actually look at that specifically. So it follows population of people. Like, you'll have a non-smoker group, you'll have a smoker group, and then you can see how many in each category got lung cancer, and then you can try to tease out what other factors were going on. Could there have been other mitigating factors or contributing factors, that sort of a thing. And then what's considered the strongest or the best is the randomized control trial. These are like pharmaceutical studies where there's a new drug, and you want to have a control group that does not get the drug, and then you want to have the experimental group that does get the drug, and then you follow those people over time to see what the outcomes actually are. So that's a little bit of an overview there, in case that's helpful to you as you do a little bit of your own research. But what I want you to take away from all of that is the fact that the journals that are being used to um, eh, describe how many people are gender nonconforming, those are cross-sectional, survey-based, self-reported articles, studies that are very poor statistically speaking. And I think that the conclusions drawn from them are often highly overstated. Okay, so with that, as kind of the background, let me jump into one of them. So there's an article that was published in 2012. It was based on a self-reported telephone survey that was done over a 2 or 3 year period. This was published in 2012 in the American Journal of Public Health. Okay, and it's titled Transgender Health in Massachusetts, Results from a Household Probability Sample of Adults. And these citations, by the way, are going to be posted on YouTube and Facebook and Instagram for your reference. You wouldn't. It's hard to imagine, but these are actually not easy to find because, and I went through this where I wanted more information, and even being a little savvy with how to find journals. Sometimes it's hard to know what is being used out there by the LGBTQIA community. But this is the ones being used. So those are going to be posted for you. So in this particular study, there was a telephone survey of 18-year-olds through 64-year-olds. Okay, so that's a wide range in age groups. And that's notable because more older people are not going to be on smartphones as much. I mean, yes, many will, but just in terms of being tech savvy and on all kinds of, TikTok and Instagram and, all the platforms, it's going to be the younger population that's really going to be doing that more so. So, there's a difference here in terminology and cultural awareness is what I'm trying to say. Okay. So this survey, people were asked the following question. Some people describe themselves as transgender when they experience a different gender identity from their sex at birth. For example, a person born into a male body but who feels female or lives as a woman. Do you consider yourself to be transgender? So it's like a yes or no question. Okay, 0.5% of the respondents said yes. And then there was a follow-on question where the transgender adults were more likely to be unemployed and to be living, below the poverty level. The male people who were identified as transgender were more likely to smoke and had some substance use issues. And then the article goes on to make the claim that if transgender individuals are facing discrimination in, housing and other marginalized factors, then that could be playing a role in who actually responded. But there's a statement here that I found really telling in the second page of the article. It says, we do not know to what extent the transgender respondents in our sample may have physically transitioned or use hormones or other medical interventions. So basically, you're not able to determine the health status of who's answering the questions. Okay, and then notice the subjective nature of the question. Were you born into a male body, but do you feel female or do you live as a woman? Well, people have different roles and things that they do in the home that might be more traditionally considered male or female. So, there are times where everybody feels like, they're taking on the role of your spouse or somebody that's of a different gender. That doesn't mean that you have gender dysphoria or that you're transgender. So, there's real problems with the assumption here, but they came up with a number that 0.5% of respondents were transgender. So there's also a comment here that the transgender adults in the sample, they had similar rates of health insurance and went to medical checkups regularly, which to my mind really speaks against the previous claim that transgender individuals are facing discrimination and can't get into care because they're afraid of how they're going to be treated. So this is basically saying the opposite, that that's not true. Okay. So in this particular study, it's self-reported data, and they're making conclusions that we need to have more aggressive non-discrimination policies in order to be more supportive of this particular population. But it's just a telephone survey, and they're not able to determine cause and effect. You answer a yes or no question, that doesn't mean that you're facing discrimination and that you would have less discrimination if we had different policies. So, I mean, but you see what I mean is that you're taking something that is not designed to answer your question, but then you're drawing massive conclusions from it that you just cannot, you can't conclude. All right, so I'm going to fly here. So there's another article here from the American Journal of Public Health. So, if you're a member of the public and somebody says, Dr. So and so, master's degree in public health, MD, PhD, journal from the American Journal of Public Health. I mean, you hear those credentials, you're probably going to think they're telling you something that's reliable, right? So this was published in 2017. It's called Transgender Demographics, a Household Probability Sample of U.S. Adults. So this was another telephone survey. It went out over 19 states plus Guam. And they also concluded that about 0.5% of their respondents identified as transgender. And they were simply asked the question, do you consider yourself to be transgender? And then if you answered yes, you would have a follow-on question. Do you consider yourself to be male to female or female to male or gender nonconforming, meaning in some other way? So you're basically answering yes or no questions. But the conclusion of this study basically says that the number of people who said they're transgender is very racially diverse, that's true. Don't have any issue with that. But they have higher rates of poverty, lower rates of college attendance than the non-transgender population. Okay, so that also might be true, but remember, this is not cause and effect. You cannot determine cause and effect. Somebody who has underlying mental health problems may be at risk for poverty and discrimination, other issues, don't go to college as often and aren't as successful in certain ways. But it's not because they're transgender, it's because of underlying mental health problems that they're struggling with. But a study such as this will say it's because they're transgender, which you can't say that. Okay, so this is a problem. This is non-causation, we would say. You just cannot conclude the conclusion. And then it goes on to say here that given the high rates of discrimination and harassment that transgender individuals face in school, inequalities are not surprising. So again, kind of a sweeping statement that we just need to better support people through the health system, the educational system, and they would do better despite and their problems are because they're transgender and they're being rejected by society or that they're being oppressed, when in fact some of the challenges that these people face sadly might be due to any number of other things. It's also interesting to me that this group was very racially diverse. That to me, to my mind, as a doctor, says that this is not biologically based. And why do I say that? Because many diseases are biologically based. Men have higher rates of cardiovascular disease. African Americans have higher rates of hypertension, some kidney issues. I mean, the list goes on and on. So if this is broadly found across such a wide, broad breadth of racially diverse individuals, it probably means that it's not biologically based. So you got to be careful with what you hear in journals that may sound prestigious to you. Okay, so there's another article here in the Archives of Sexual Behavior. This is 2014. This was an online questionnaire. It's called Gender Identities and Gender Dysphoria in the Netherlands. Okay, so this took a look at large age group, age 15 through 70. So also cultural context here, very, very different. And this one was a self-reported, you self-report your gender identity and whether or not you have dysphoria, but you're psychologically describing your experience as a man or a woman, and you're giving yourself a score 1 through 5. So it's like a 5-point scale type of a system. And let me read you these questions really quickly here. So it starts like this. So many men experience themselves clearly as a man. For some men, this is not completely the case. Could you indicate to which degree you psychologically experience yourself as a man? 1 is not at all, 5 is completely. And could you indicate to which degree you psychologically experience yourself as a woman? 1 is not at all, 5 is completely. Okay. So then the gender dysphoric feelings were then further teased out with some follow-up questions about dislike. So do you have a dislike of your male body? Absolutely, or somewhat, or not really, or not at all. and then whether or not you wanted hormones or surgery to change parts of their body to affirm the experienced gender. So again, here we have emphasis on feelings and experience and psychologically how you consider yourself to be. But it's a self score, 1 through 5. That's very, very subjective. Okay, and then the question says, you know, basically, do you like your body? Do you dislike your body? So people could say that they don't like their body for like a billion different reasons. Are you too tall? Are you too short? Are you bald? Are you too overweight? Do you not have enough muscle tone? Or, you know, you get what I'm saying. So these are very subjective questions, and people are self-scoring themselves, um, and it's just not able to provide you, a sound conclusion. So here's another statement here. It says in this article that the main limitation of the study is a low response rate, which was true. Only about 20% of people actually responded and answered the questions. Um, and then there's also a statement here that, just like what I said, that you could answer the question in any number of ways because you might not like your body. You just might not like your body. That doesn't mean you're transgender, um, necessarily. Okay, so Archives of Sexual Behavior 2015. This article is another survey. It's prevalence of gender nonconformity in Flanders, Belgium. The number of people in this particular survey that were gender ambivalent, meaning that they're not sure of their gender, was 2%, or gender incongruent, 0.7%. And the questions were likewise very subjective and feelings based. So people were asked, women were asked, I feel like a woman, or I'm sorry, everybody was asked. This is the 1 to 5 point scale again. I feel like a woman, or I feel like a man. I look feminine, or I look masculine. I wish to be more feminine, and I wish to be more masculine. So these are very subjective questions. You can't determine cause. There are times where um, I think everybody feels that they're behaving or doing something that might make them feel more masculine or feminine, but that doesn't mean that you have gender dysphoria. Okay, there's also some bias in the culture too that will influence how people answer. So you've heard of the toxic masculinity, right? So if people are programmed that feeling like a man is toxic and negative, then who's going to want that? So, you have men who don't want to answer highly that, yeah, I'm masculine and I want to be more masculine because that's considered a negative, bad thing. So there's all kinds of problems with studies like this. Okay. So 1.4% of men reported feeling like a woman, 2.4 did not feel like a man. Okay, 2.3% desired to be more feminine. But what does that mean? Does that mean you want to be a better caretaker of your kids? Or, I mean, I don't know. Doesn't say. Um, when asked about their appearance, 1.1% of men thought they looked feminine, and 2.2% believe that they did not look masculine, and similar numbers for women about their appearance. But appearance is subjective, as you know, and this, I would say, this has nothing to do with whether or not somebody has gender dysphoria. Okay, moving on here. So this is from, I'm looking here to remind myself where this was published. So this is the proportion of adults in the general population of Stockholm County, that's in Sweden, who want gender-affirming medical care. Okay, this is 2018. So this particular study, this was a survey of people ages 22 and greater, and the question was, here's the question: I would like hormones or surgery to be more like someone of a different sex. And then there were some additional follow-up questions. I feel like someone of a different sex, and I would like to live as or be treated as someone of a different sex. And then you can either answer not at all, somewhat, occasionally, quite correct, or absolutely correct. But what they did was they took people who said somewhat or occasionally, and they included those people in the positive answer. So that's going to skew your numbers way higher, right? Because everybody at some point might feel this way for any variety of reason, right? So you get all these false positives. It's very vague. People who reject the gender stereotypes, that sort of a thing can really skew these type of numbers. Um, so, the desire for gender affirming care was found to be about 0.5%. And the number of people who felt like someone of a different sex or who would like to be treated as someone of a different sex was about 2.5%. Um, so this study took a little bit of a look at these rates around the world. And in 2005, that's what I was talking about 0.01%, about one in or less. One in 100,000 people would feel this way. But in 2015, 10 years later, it's now 8 in 100,000. So 8 times, 800% increase with no explanation. I would submit that the explanation is social media driven and cultural and political. Okay, so the Journal of Adolescent Health 2013 published this article looking at high school students. So we're getting into kind of the kids. The health and well-being of transgender high school students results from the New Zealand Adolescent Health Survey. Okay, so this was basically designed to determine the prevalence, the incidence of transgenderism and access to their health care and their overall well-being. So whether or not somebody was transgender was measured by this particular question here. Do you think you are transgender? This is a girl who feels like she should have been a boy or a boy who feels like he should have been a girl. Okay, and then students were categorized into 4 different groups: those who reported being non-transgender, who reported being transgender, who those were not sure of their gender, and those who did not understand the question. And then they were asked, what sex are you, male or female? And then they asked some questions about sexual attraction to the opposite sex or the same sex, how old these individuals were when they started to have these questions, divided by age groups. And then what they tried to do, and this is worth thinking about for a second, they tried to tease out what factors might be protective and what might help transgender students do better. So they asked questions like, does at least one patient care for you? Um, how much do you feel the following people care about you? Your father or someone who acts as your father, your mom or someone who acts as your mom, whether or not your family got along. Um, you would answer well or very well, whether friends cared a lot for them. How much do you feel your friends care about you? Is school okay? How do you feel about school? Do you participate in activities to help others at school? Do you volunteer in the community? Do you give time to help others in the community? Um, and then they go on to ask questions like, in the past 12 months, how often have you been afraid that someone will hurt or bother you at school? How often have you been bullied in school? Do you feel safe in your neighborhood? They were asked either all of the time or sometimes. And then during the past 12 months, have you been hit physically or harmed by another person on purpose? And then they ask about like sexual assault. So basically, they're trying to get at what's going on in the lives of these individuals a little bit more deeply, and that's useful. That's good. I'm glad we're thinking in that direction. They ask during the past 12 months, have you deliberately hurt yourself? So now we're getting into like risk of suicidality. Have you tried to kill yourself or actually attempt? Um, but here's the problem that it's not causative. So, for example, somebody might be struggling in any one of these ways with family, friends, at school, may or may not choose to be involved in the community for any number of reasons. And people who are depressed, they're anxious. We just came out of the pandemic. Homes are broken. There's a lot going on with young people today. It's not surprising to me that we do have an epidemic of mental health issues. So, just because the individuals on this questionnaire were experiencing some of these negative things, but also had some of these positive things too, that doesn't mean that there's an association with they being transgender or not. It could have just been going on in their life anyway because of underlying factors. So these are like causation problems, biases where the study is not designed to answer the intended question, but the authors go on to conclude that transgender individuals suffer from bullying and from being assaulted and doing poorly in school and not having the support that they need from family and friends and all of those things that we talked about. And what stood out to me as well in this one was that the number of kids who said that they're not sure of their gender was more than double the number of people who said that they were transgender. Okay, so causation problems. A lot of these kids had depression, had self-harmed, and so forth, but that doesn't mean it's because of a gender non-conformity issue. And then in the conclusion of this article, they go on to say that schools and locker rooms and bathrooms and sports teams, written records, dress codes, all of these things require better policies that will help transgender students feel that they're getting greater attention and positive encouragement. Um, so, you know, I think the conclusions are not valid. I get that it's important. We want to be loving and compassionate of all people, no matter what. But to say that there's a link and a cause is not demonstrated in these articles. Okay. Here's another one: the Journal of Adolescent Health, 2016. Risk and protective factors in the lives of transgender or gender nonconforming adolescents. Okay, so causation again is a problem. So the transgender and nonconforming prevalence was 2.7%, varied widely across race, ethnicity, and so forth. And this took another look at the protective factors and also the risky behaviors. And it talks about the need for healthcare providers to create safe spaces for young people to better provide, gender affirming care type of climate. The question used in this survey was, you're measuring birth assigned sex, either male or female, and then you ask, do you consider yourself transgender, genderqueer, gender fluid, or unsure about your gender? Yes or no. And that's it. I mean, just yes or no. And then there are questions about substance abuse, sexual behavior, emotional distress, bullying, victimization, smoking, alcohol, other drugs, emotional distress, depression. And then some of the protective factors, like you're able to express your feelings in positive ways, family connectedness, ability to talk to your mother or father, teacher-student relationships, being treated fairly at school, being safe going to and from school, being safe in your neighborhood. Let me just say that everybody should feel safe in their home and in their neighborhood, in their school, in their community. And there, I'm sure, many transgender individuals that have been bullied and harassed and discriminated against, and that's an awful thing. So I want to make sure that I acknowledge that. I'm not saying that that doesn't happen or that's not true, but I'm just making a general observation through these articles that trying to make the conclusions that these studies are claiming are not valid conclusions in and of themselves in this manner that was constructed. I don't want to play down the fact that people suffer and are real. I'm going to move on here. Couple things that I'll mention to wrap up, and I'm going to take some questions here in a moment. So let me just end it with one further article here in JAMA, Journal of American Medical Association Pediatrics, 2018. And this shows the 800 times increase in incidence here. It's a survey comparing similar groups, also asking the questions to stratify people. Are you somewhat, very, or mostly feminine, or very, somewhat, or mostly male, and so forth? Causation is a significant issue here as well. Let me just stop there. I don't want to give you too much or get too bogged down in some of the weeds here, but I think you get where I'm going. Where policymakers should not be using cross-sectional surveys like this to create policy, especially gender affirming care, or to push ideology through the school system. we need to do a better job of understanding all of the issues for sure. But these are a core group of articles that will be used to show support for just how much of a problem we have in society with higher than previously thought numbers of transgender individuals and what we should do to try to help support them more. So just bear in mind that there are a lot of design flaws inherent in how these were done. These are telephone, internet, self-reported surveys using questions that are not statistically necessarily sound, and conclusions that are also not necessarily statistically sound. So I'm going to stop there. I want to be respectful of everyone's time so it doesn't get too late on you, and there are some questions, so I'm happy to start taking those now. We'll have those here. I'll read those. Okay, so servant slayer. So this guy just changed terminology. So I mean, yeah. So there are a lot of terms that are being used in the LGBTQIA community, and I think part of it is simply because it's really difficult to put your finger on what somebody's experience might be. Their biological sex, and then also your gender identity, and then your gender expression, and then you have gender dysphoria. All of these things, I think it's well intentioned. They're trying to be able to describe things and create terminology so we can identify who we're talking about and when some of their particular what's going on with them. So I think that's the goal, and that's not a bad thing. But I'm trying to point out that the terminology itself has assumptions built into it that is very problematic. Notably, that it's simply not, it's feelings based issues that are in the mind of individuals, not in the body of the individuals, and that's the key issue that I have with it. All right, let's go on to another question here. Servant Slayer again. I have a question. We can reduce this problem of gender on a language issue or genetic issue. So I don't believe that there is a genetic issue. So in our next broadcast, I'm going to get into the intersex question of people that have actual genetic anomalies and what that really means. But I think yes, like on a language basis, I think we need to help redirect people to understand that the language is really referring to what's happening in their mind on the basis of the psychological conditions that are underpinning what they're experiencing. And I think we can do that. We can try to tease out the fact that these terms are really telling you that this is not inherent in your biological sex. This is how you feel yourself to be. And I think that's really a great way to start, is just to try to open that door of conversation and see how that goes. And always, of course, be respectful and compassionate with people who are struggling with this, because the distress is real, and that's for sure. So we don't want to come across in such a way where we're picking a battle. We want to just always listen and be respectful, but also try to say, hey, what do you think of what does this mean to you? How does this really fit into how you're feeling? What is that? Tell me more about what that means to you, and then engage the conversation and see how that goes. The references, the articles that I've mentioned too, will be in the video description, so that is going to be available for you. Let's see if we have any other questions here, scrolling through here. All right, I think that that might be a wrap. So thanks everybody for joining. I really appreciate it. I know this was a little bit of a different type of a program, with getting into a little bit more of the technical things with the journal articles, but I felt like it was a resource that I really wanted to try to get out there for you. So Doc'd Out, you can always email me anytime, Steve@docdout.org, and I'll get back with you. Search for Docked Out Official, all as one word together, on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram. Website is dockedout.org, and you'll see some blogs and links there that you might find interesting. So great to be with you again, and we'll see you next time. Take care, everybody. Have a good night.